It was early March when everything happened. That strange, in-between time when winter hasn't quite given up, but spring hasn't arrived either. I was 19, living at home with my mom in a quiet neighborhood outside of Indianapolis. She worked overnight shifts at a local hospital 3 or 4 nights a week, which meant that for most of those nights, I had the house completely to myself. I'd never minded it before. We lived in a pretty safe area, a small cul-de-sac with maybe 10 houses total. Everyone knew each other. The kind of place where people left their porch lights on just to make the street feel friendly. But that particular night, a Thursday, something about the air felt different, heavier, quieter. Mom had left around 6:30 p.m., kissing my forehead and saying she'd be back around 7 the next morning. I remember she told me to bring the trash cans in before it got too late, and I waved her off, saying I'd get to it after my show. The sun set around 7 that night, and by 8, the neighborhood was almost silent. I brought the trash cans in, locked the front door, and settled into the couch to watch some movie on Netflix. Everything was normal. The only sounds were the low hum of the TV and the occasional car in the distance. Sometime around 10:30, I heard a noise from outside. It was faint at first, like the soft squeak of metal, followed by a dull thud. I paused the TV, thinking maybe the wind had knocked something over. The sound came again, this time louder. It was the gate. We had a chain-link fence that enclosed the backyard, and there was a metal latch on the gate that always made that high-pitched squeal when you opened it. I recognized the sound immediately. I muted the TV and listened. The latch squealed again, and then the gate clanged shut. For a few seconds, I sat frozen, staring toward the back of the house. My first thought was that maybe one of the neighbor's kids was cutting through the yard. That wasn't uncommon during the summer, but this was March. Cold, dark. I turned off the TV and walked slowly to the kitchen window that overlooked the backyard. The porch light was off, and the yard was just a black stretch of shadow against the faint snow. I squinted, but couldn't see anything. Then, in the far corner by the fence, something moved, just the faintest flicker of motion, like someone shifting their weight. I backed away from the window, heart thudding so hard I felt it in my throat. I turned the kitchen light off, thinking maybe I could see better in the dark. I stood there waiting for my eyes to adjust. When they did, I saw it clearly. There was someone standing in the corner of the yard, a tall figure dressed in dark clothes, half hidden behind the fence post. I couldn't see their face, but I could tell they were facing the house, just standing there, watching. I stayed completely still, not even breathing. The figure didn't move. After a few seconds, I ducked down below the window, crawled toward the counter, and grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I called 911. The dispatcher asked what was happening, and I told her someone was in my yard. She said an officer would be there soon and told me to stay on the line. While I waited, I peeked up again. Just for a second, the figure was gone. The backyard was empty. The gate, though, was swinging open. When the police arrived about 10 minutes later, they checked the fence and the yard, but found nothing. No footprints, no sign of forced entry, nothing. The officer was kind, but said it was probably an animal or maybe a neighbor cutting through. I knew it wasn't. I thanked them anyway, locked up again, and tried to shake it off. I even laughed at myself a little once they left, thinking maybe I'd overreacted. I turned the TV back on, tried to finish my movie, and eventually went to bed around midnight. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound that made my blood turn cold. It was coming from inside the house. Soft, careful footsteps moving across the living room floor. I lay completely still, every muscle locked. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Someone was in the house. I reached for my phone, which was charging on my nightstand, and texted my mom. Someone's in the house. Then I called 911 again, whispering as quietly as I could. The dispatcher told me to stay where I was, keep quiet, and lock the door if I could. I slid out of bed as silently as possible, turned the lock on my door, and crouched behind my dresser, phone pressed to my ear. The footsteps came closer, slow, deliberate, like whoever it was knew to move quietly. I could hear the faint creak of the hallway floorboards outside my room. Then they stopped. Right outside my door. I held my breath, clutching my phone so tightly my knuckles hurt. The doorknob turned. Just once, slowly, carefully, but the lock held. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Someone was standing on the other side of the door, listening. For a long minute, there was nothing. Then I heard a whisper. Low. Male. Come on. That was it. 2 words, then silence. The dispatcher kept asking if I was still there, and I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I was too terrified to speak. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I heard the sound of sirens. The footsteps retreated quickly down the hall, followed by the sound of the back door slamming. When the police arrived, they found the back door wide open. The screen had been cut, the lock forced from the outside. They searched the house and yard, but whoever it was had already disappeared into the woods behind the fence. They found muddy footprints in the kitchen leading from the back door toward the hallway. But the scariest part came when one of the officers went outside with a flashlight and looked toward the fence. He called me over to show me something. In the mud, near the back corner where I'd first seen the figure, were several cigarette butts. Not new. Some of them looked like they'd been there for days. Next to them was a small pile of empty snack wrappers. He told me someone had been watching the house, probably for a while. After that night, I couldn't stay there alone anymore. Mom switched to daytime shifts, and we got motion lights installed around the whole property. For a long time after, I'd wake up at the slightest sound, every creak, every gust of wind outside the window. Months later, the police told us they'd caught someone a few streets over trying to break into another home, a man who'd been living out of his truck, targeting houses where women stayed alone at night. He fit the description of a tall man in dark clothes. He had tools in his car, lockpicks, knives, and zip ties. I don't know for sure if it was him, but I think about it every time I remember those cigarette butts by the fence. How long he might have been standing there, smoking, watching our house, waiting for me to be alone. Story, the end. It was a Friday night in late November when my parents decided to take a last-minute weekend trip to a nearby lake cabin. They'd been working nonstop and wanted a quick escape before winter really settled in. I was 17, responsible enough to stay home, and I practically begged them to let me. They agreed after making me promise to lock up, not have any friends over, and call them if anything seemed off. Our house sat in a quiet corner of a suburban neighborhood in upstate New York. Nothing ever happened there. It was the kind of place where people left their garage doors open, kids rode bikes until dark, and everyone waved at each other. Safe. Or at least that's what I thought. My parents left around 5 p.m. I watched their car disappear down the street and felt that strange mix of freedom and loneliness. The house suddenly felt bigger, emptier. I ordered pizza, turned on some music, and settled in to enjoy being completely alone for once. The first few hours were great. I played video games, texted friends, and half-watched some random movie. Around 9:30, I noticed it had started raining outside. Hard. It wasn't a gentle drizzle, but the kind of cold, relentless downpour that makes the night feel darker than it should. The sound of the rain against the windows was oddly soothing, and I didn't think much of it until the power flickered. It didn't go out completely, just dimmed for a few seconds and came back. I remember laughing nervously and saying to myself, "Not tonight, please." But even after it steadied, the house didn't feel the same. At around 10:15, I went to lock up for the night. I checked the back door first, then the sliding glass door that opened to the backyard. That's when I saw it. There were footprints in the mud just outside the sliding door. Bare footprints. The rain was coming down so hard that anything left outside should have been washed away almost immediately, but these were fresh, perfectly defined, leading right up to the glass and stopping there. I stared at them for a long moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The prints were large, like an adult man's, and close together, as if whoever left them had been standing there, just watching. I turned off the light in the kitchen to see outside better, but the backyard was pitch black. Only the faint outline of the fence and a few trees were visible. My heart started to race. I double-checked that the door was locked and closed the curtain. I told myself it could have been an old print, maybe from earlier in the day, but deep down I knew that was impossible. I went back to the living room and turned the TV up, trying to drown out the sound of the rain and my own thoughts. A half hour passed before I heard it, a dull thump from the back of the house. I muted the TV. Another thump, followed by what sounded like soft scraping on the glass door. My stomach dropped. I stood up slowly, gripping the remote like it could protect me, and crept toward the kitchen. The sound stopped. I reached the doorway, peeked around the corner, and froze. The curtain I had closed over the sliding door was moving. Not wildly, not from the wind, but from something brushing against it, something outside. I could see a faint outline through the shape of a person, tall, unmoving. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just stood there, staring, every instinct screaming not to make a sound. After a few seconds, the shape shifted slightly like it had turned its head. Then slowly it moved away. I ran upstairs to my room, locked the door, and called my parents. No answer. Then I called 911. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hit the numbers. The dispatcher picked up, her voice calm and professional. I told her someone was outside my house. She asked if I was sure. I told her about the footprints, the sound, the shadow through the curtain. She said an officer was on the way and told me to stay where I was. While I was on the phone, I heard the sound of something creaking downstairs. Not outside, inside. I froze. The dispatcher must have heard the silence because she asked, "Are you okay?" I whispered, "I think he's in the house." She told me to stay quiet, stay hidden, and keep her on the line. I backed away from the door and crouched in the corner of my room, trying not to make any noise. My mind was racing. How did he get in? All the doors were locked. Then I remembered the basement window. It was small, barely big enough for an adult to squeeze through, but it didn't latch properly. My dad had been meaning to fix it for months. I realized then that it wasn't just possible, it was the only way in. I could hear soft footsteps on the stairs now. Slow, deliberate. My heart pounded so hard I thought he could probably hear it. I whispered into the phone, "He's coming upstairs." The dispatcher said the police were 3 minutes away. 3 minutes. That felt like a lifetime. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and stopped. I could hear breathing, just outside my door. Shallow, ragged breathing, like whoever was out there was trying not to make noise but couldn't quite control it. I watched the doorknob start to turn, slowly, as if testing whether it was locked. I covered my mouth to stop myself from crying out. The knob turned harder. The door rattled once, then stopped. Silence. For a few seconds, I thought maybe he'd given up, but then I heard something even worse. A whisper. A low, hoarse voice, right outside the door. "I know you're in there." Tears streamed down my face as I whispered back to the dispatcher that he was trying to get in. She told me the police were pulling up to the house. She said not to move, not to make a sound. I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. The moment they became audible, the breathing outside my door stopped. Then came the sound of hurried footsteps going back down the stairs. A door slammed somewhere below. I stayed there, shaking, listening as the sirens grew louder until I finally saw flashing red and blue lights through my window. The officers found the back door slightly open, muddy footprints leading in and out. They cleared the house, weapons drawn, but whoever had been there was gone. The rain had nearly washed away the prints outside, but they could still see where someone had stood right up against the glass door. When they checked the basement, they found the small window broken open, mud on the floor, smears of dirt along the wall. But there was something else, something that made one of the officers call for backup. They found a sleeping bag tucked behind the furnace, an old one, moldy, damp. Next to it was a pile of wrappers, empty water bottles, and a small flashlight. Someone had been living down there. For how long, no one knew. The officer said the person must have slipped in weeks ago, maybe longer, hiding out during the day, waiting until everyone was asleep to move around. I thought about all the times I'd heard strange noises late at night and brushed them off as the house settling. The times food had gone missing from the pantry, the weird drafts, the faint footsteps I'd always convinced myself were just in my head. It wasn't my imagination. He'd been there. The police never caught him. They found muddy footprints leading from the basement window out into the woods behind the house, but they ended after a few hundred feet. The rain erased the trail. My parents came home the next morning and found me still sitting in my room, wrapped in a blanket, unable to sleep. My dad replaced the basement window that same day, and we put new locks on every door. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. For weeks afterward, I couldn't be in the house alone. Every creak made me jump. Every sound felt like a whisper from somewhere I couldn't see. I kept replaying the voice in my head. I know you're in there. It's been years now, and I live in a different house, a different town, but sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet and the rain starts to fall, I swear I hear footsteps in the hall outside my room. Slow, deliberate, careful. And sometimes, when I wake up in the morning and look out at the yard, I see them. Muddy footprints just a few feet from the window, leading nowhere. Story the end. It was a Friday evening in late January when everything began. Cold, silent, and almost unnaturally still. My parents had gone to visit my grandmother in Pennsylvania for the weekend, leaving me home alone in our small 2-story house in rural Ohio. I was 17, old enough to stay by myself, and honestly, I was looking forward to it. I had plans to watch movies, eat pizza, and just relax without anyone nagging me about chores or curfews. The first night started exactly like that. I ordered food, turned up the TV, and sprawled out on the couch in sweatpants. The house was warm and comfortable, and even though the world outside was covered in snow, I didn't feel uneasy. At least not yet. It was the kind of quiet that felt peaceful, like the rest of the world was asleep and you were the only one awake. But that silence started to feel heavier around midnight. I just switched from a movie to my playlist when I noticed something strange. The motion light on the porch flicked on. I froze. Through the front window, I could see the yard bathed in the yellowish glow of the light, but there was nothing there. No animal tracks, no wind moving the trees, no reason it should have triggered. I brushed it off as a glitch. Maybe the light was just old. 15 minutes later, it happened again. I paused my music, my stomach tightening. The light flicked on, stayed bright for a moment, and then shut off. I waited. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. I got up, moved to the window, and looked out again. Still nothing. The front yard was just a blanket of untouched snow. I told myself it was nothing, but a voice in the back of my mind whispered that maybe someone was out there, someone standing just out of sight, behind the trees watching. Around 1:30, I decided to go upstairs and call it a night. I checked all the doors and windows, made sure they were locked, and climbed into bed. I left my phone charging beside me. Sleep didn't come easily, though. The silence pressed against the house, heavy and total. Every small creak sounded magnified. Then came the tapping. It was faint at first, like fingernails lightly brushing the glass. I froze, straining to listen. It came again, 3 short, slow taps on my bedroom window. My bed was against the far wall, but I could see the faint outline of the window across the room. My heart started pounding. The window was on the 2nd floor. There was no way anyone could be tapping it unless they were using a ladder or somehow tall enough to reach it. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The taps came again, a little louder this time, deliberate. I reached for my phone, my hands shaking, and texted my best friend, Chris, me. Someone's tapping on my window. Chris, you're joking. Me, I'm not. I swear. He called me right away, whispering, You sure it's not a tree branch or something? There's nothing outside my window. I hissed. It's the 2nd floor. While I was still on the phone, it came again. 3 sharp taps, louder, closer. My entire body locked up. Chris heard it too. Dude, call the cops. Now. I hung up and dialed 911. My voice was shaking as I told the dispatcher what was happening. She told me to stay on the line, stay inside, and not go near the windows. I backed away from the glass, gripping my phone like a lifeline. The tapping stopped. Then came the sound of something scraping against the siding, like fingers dragging slowly along the wall outside my room. The dispatcher said officers were on the way. I crouched by the door, shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. The scraping moved toward the corner of the house, then stopped. I stayed there, whispering into the phone, I can hear it moving. The dispatcher kept me calm, asking questions, trying to keep me focused until the police arrived. Then, without warning, I heard something slam downstairs. A heavy thud followed by the sound of the back door creaking open. I gasped, nearly dropping the phone. Someone's inside, I whispered frantically. The dispatcher's tone changed instantly. Get somewhere safe. Lock the door if you can. The officers are almost there. I locked my bedroom door, shoved my dresser against it, and crouched behind my bed. Every nerve in my body was screaming. I could hear movement downstairs, slow, deliberate footsteps on the hardwood floor. The floorboards creaked one by one, like whoever it was wanted me to hear them coming. Then the footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. My mind was spinning. What if it wasn't just one person? What if they knew I was here? A few seconds later, the sound of creaking stairs made my blood run cold. Whoever it was had started coming up. I could hear each step slow and heavy, like someone dragging their feet. I whispered to the dispatcher, "They're coming upstairs." Her voice stayed calm, but I could tell she was tense. "The officers are almost there. Stay quiet." The steps got closer. I could hear breathing now, raspy, uneven. They stopped right outside my door. The handle turned slowly. The lock rattled. I pressed myself against the wall, covering my mouth. I didn't dare make a sound. The handle twisted again, harder this time. Then a low, distorted voice, like someone whispering through the crack of the door, said, "I can hear you." My heart nearly stopped. The voice was wrong. It didn't sound natural. It was low and hoarse, like someone forcing out words through clenched teeth. Then came the sound of the doorknob rattling violently, like whoever it was had lost patience. The dresser shook as the door jolted. I was about to scream when flashing red and blue lights filled the room. The sirens outside were so loud they almost hurt my ears. I heard someone yell downstairs, an officer's voice, and then the front door slammed open. The noises stopped. When the police finally came upstairs, I couldn't move. They had to help me up, my legs barely working. The door to my room was scratched around the handle, like someone had been prying at it. The back door downstairs was wide open, the frame splintered. They searched the entire house, the yard, the woods behind us. Nothing. No footprints, no ladder, no sign of forced entry except the back door. One of the officers told me it might have been a vagrant or a burglar scared off when they arrived. But when I asked about the window, about how someone could have reached it, he just frowned. There were no footprints in the snow below it, no sign that anyone had ever been there. That night, I stayed at a neighbor's house. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that voice in my head again. "I can hear you." When my parents got back, I told them everything. My dad changed all the locks, installed new security cameras, and even replaced the motion light. For a while, things felt normal again. Then, about 3 weeks later, I was home alone again, sitting on the couch doing homework when the porch light flicked on. I froze, staring at the window. The snow outside was falling lightly, soft and quiet, and through the glass I could just barely see a shape standing at the edge of the yard, tall, thin, unmoving. I blinked, thinking maybe I was imagining it, but it didn't disappear. It just stood there, watching. When I finally worked up the courage to get closer to the window, it was gone. No footprints, no movement, nothing. But when I went to lock the front door, I saw something wedged in the gap near the bottom, a folded piece of paper. I hesitated, then picked it up. Inside, in jagged handwriting, were the words, "You're lucky the cops got here last time." I dropped it instantly, my hands shaking so bad I could barely breathe. I called my dad, and when he got home, the note was gone. We looked everywhere for it, under the porch, around the yard, but it had vanished completely, as if it was never there. To this day, no one believes what I saw or heard that night. The police never found anyone, and the cameras never caught a thing. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I still hear faint tapping on the windows. Always 3 slow taps. And every single time I freeze, holding my breath, waiting for that same low voice to whisper through the dark again. Story. The end. It was the summer before my senior year of high school, and for the first time in my life, I was trusted to stay home alone for an entire weekend. My parents were going to a cousin's wedding in Chicago, and I didn't want to go. It was supposed to be my independence test. We lived in a quiet neighborhood in Northern Virginia, a cul-de-sac surrounded by thick woods. Everyone knew each other, and it wasn't the kind of place where you worried about locking doors or checking behind you at night. That Friday evening started off normal. I ordered Chinese food, set up in the living room, and watched a couple of movies with the windows open to let in the cool night air. By 10 o'clock, the crickets were singing and a soft breeze came through the house. It was calm, peaceful. Then, around 10:45, I heard something. It wasn't loud at first, just a faint knocking sound. I paused the movie and listened. Nothing. I unmuted the TV, then it came again, a little louder. A dull, steady knocking, like someone tapping gently on glass. I thought it might be a branch hitting the window from the wind, but when I muted the TV again, the sound came from the back of the house. 3 slow knocks, then silence. The hairs on my arms stood up. I went to the kitchen, trying to act like it was nothing, and peeked through the window above the sink. Darkness. Just the glow from the patio light reflecting off the wet grass. The rain earlier had left everything slick and shiny. I squinted, trying to see past the glare, and froze. There was a man standing at the edge of the yard, not moving, not walking toward the house, just standing. He was tall, maybe 6 feet or more, and wearing a dark jacket. I couldn't see his face clearly because of the distance and the dim light, but I could tell he was facing the house. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. My first thought was that maybe it was a neighbor, maybe Mr. Lang from across the street checking on me. But when I turned on the porch light, the man moved. Not toward the house. He just took a few steps backward into the shadows until he was swallowed by the trees. I locked every door I could find. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just someone cutting through the yard. Maybe I was overreacting. But deep down, something about the way he stood there, completely still, watching, made my stomach twist. By midnight, I was still awake, sitting in the living room with all the lights on, scrolling through my phone to distract myself. The night had gone quiet again, and I was starting to relax a little. Then I heard it, the creak of a floorboard upstairs. My breath caught. I hadn't been upstairs since earlier that evening. I knew for a fact every window was locked. I turned off the TV and just listened. The house went still. I waited, 30 seconds, a minute, and then I heard it again. A slow, dragging sound. Someone was up there. I grabbed my phone and backed toward the front door. I wanted to run out of the house, but part of me didn't want to make any noise. My thumb hovered over the call 911 button, but then the sound stopped. The silence stretched on, and I started to think maybe it was the old pipes or the air vents, until something fell. A loud crash, like something heavy being knocked over, came from my bedroom upstairs. That was enough. I bolted out the front door barefoot, sprinting across the yard to my neighbor's porch. I pounded on the door until Mr. Lang opened it, confused and half asleep. I told him someone was in my house, and he grabbed a flashlight while his wife called the police. The cops arrived in under 10 minutes. They searched the house top to bottom, but didn't find anyone. Nothing was stolen, nothing seemed broken, except for my bedside lamp. It was on the floor, shattered. What they did find was worse. In the mud outside the back of the house, right below my bedroom window, were footprints, bare footprints. The prints led from the woods straight to the side of the house. One of the officers thought maybe someone had climbed the lattice near the window. When they shined their lights up, they found faint handprints on the siding. Whoever it was had been outside my window, maybe trying to get in. The police took a report, told me to stay with a neighbor until morning, and said they'd patrol the area overnight. I barely slept at all. The next day my parents wanted to come home early, but I told them I'd be fine. I tried convincing myself it was over, that whoever it was had just picked the wrong house and moved on. That night, I slept on the couch downstairs, all the doors locked, blinds closed. Around 2 a.m., I woke up needing water. The house was dead silent, except for the low hum of the fridge. I grabbed a glass and stood by the sink, half asleep, when I noticed something strange. One of the blinds over the kitchen window wasn't fully closed. There was a thin gap, maybe half an inch, just enough to see outside, and someone was staring in. I froze, heart pounding so hard I thought it might stop. Through that narrow slit, I could see an eye. A man's eye. Bloodshot. Wide open. I screamed and dropped the glass. It shattered on the floor. By the time I ran to the door and flipped on the outside lights, there was no one there. The police came again. This time, they searched the woods and found more footprints. Bare, again, leading deeper into the trees. They followed them about 100 feet before they disappeared near the creek. They said it was probably a homeless man or someone strung out on drugs, hiding out there. For weeks after that, I refused to stay home alone. My parents installed motion lights and cameras, but nothing ever showed up again. Life eventually went back to normal, but that image, the eye staring through the window, never left me. Then, 3 months later, something happened that made my blood run cold. I got a text from an unknown number. No name, just a photo. It was my house, taken from the woods. The angle looked exactly like the view from behind the tree line. Underneath the photo, the message said, "You looked right at me." I called the police immediately, but they couldn't trace the number. It had been sent from a temporary online account. They increased patrols again for a few weeks, but nothing else happened. We moved the following year. Even now, living in an apartment on the 5th floor, I can't sleep with the blinds open. If I hear a knock, even just from the wind, I freeze. And sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night and glance toward the window, I swear I feel the same thing I felt that summer, someone watching from just beyond the glass. Story, the end. It was early March when it happened, a stretch of cold rain and gray skies that made everything feel heavy and silent. My parents had gone out of town for 3 days to visit my aunt in Ohio, leaving me alone in the house for the weekend. I was 18, finishing up my senior year of high school, and it didn't seem like a big deal. We lived just outside a small town in Pennsylvania, in one of those quiet neighborhoods where every house looked the same. 2 stories, big yards, driveways that sloped down to the road, the kind of place where nothing ever really happens. That Friday afternoon, after my parents left, I did what any kid would do. I made a mess of the kitchen making grilled cheese, blasted music, and stayed up way too late watching movies. The rain never stopped that night. It just drizzled and hissed against the windows for hours. Around midnight, when I finally turned the TV off, I realized how unnervingly quiet the house was. No traffic, no dogs barking, no voices, just rain and the low hum of the refrigerator. I went to bed and scrolled through my phone until I started to nod off. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of knocking. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the pattern was too steady. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. I sat up, heart pounding, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It wasn't the front door. It sounded closer, somewhere near the kitchen, maybe the side entrance. I slipped out of bed and crept to the top of the stairs. The house was dark, except for the small nightlight in the hallway. I held my breath and listened. The knocking came again. 3 short knocks this time, sharper, closer. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer near the stairs and made my way down. Each step creaked like it was trying to betray me. When I reached the kitchen, I stopped and shined the light toward the side door. The curtain over the small window swayed slightly, and my stomach dropped. Someone had touched it. I flicked on the kitchen light and walked to the door, but there was no one there. Just rain, slick pavement, and the sound of wind moving through the trees. My heart was hammering, but I locked the door again, made sure every latch was sealed tight, and went back upstairs. I told myself it was just some kid from the neighborhood messing around. It wouldn't be the first time. Still, it took a long time for me to fall asleep after that. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. My friend Jason was texting me asking if I wanted to hang out. I told him maybe later and got up to make breakfast. When I walked into the kitchen, I froze. There were muddy footprints on the floor. Not big, about the size of my own shoes. But they weren't mine. They led from the back door to the kitchen counter and stopped right in front of the fridge. I just stood there, staring, my throat dry. The weirdest part was that the footprints weren't soaking wet like they should have been if someone had come in from the rain. They were faded, like they'd been there for hours. I checked every door again. Locked. Every window. Locked. The rest of the day was tense. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house felt different, like the air itself had shifted. I tried to distract myself with homework, but I kept catching faint sounds, floorboards creaking upstairs, something brushing against the walls, faint tapping that would start and stop without rhythm. That night, I decided to sleep on the couch downstairs. I figured if anyone tried to get in again, I'd hear it. I left a lamp on and wrapped myself in a blanket, half watching TV, half listening to the rain. Around 2 a.m., I heard movement. Not outside, inside. It was coming from upstairs. I muted the TV, heart pounding in my throat. The sound was slow, deliberate, like footsteps crossing my bedroom floor. Then silence. I didn't move. I sat frozen on the couch, staring up at the ceiling, straining to hear anything. After a minute or two, I heard it again, but this time it sounded like something dragging lightly against the carpet. I finally got up, holding the flashlight like a weapon, and crept toward the stairs. Every muscle in my body screamed not to go up, but I had to know. When I reached the top, everything was still. The door to my room was cracked open. I pushed it gently and it swung wide, revealing the dark room inside. My heart sank when I saw the window. It was open. Cold air drifted in, making the curtains flutter. I could have sworn I had locked it the night before. I stepped closer, shining the light around the room. Nothing seemed touched, except for one thing. My closet door was slightly ajar. For a moment, I thought about leaving. Running out the front door, calling the cops, doing anything else. But instead, I reached for the closet handle and yanked it open. Nothing. Just clothes, shoes, and old boxes stacked on the floor. I slammed it shut and locked the window tight, then went back downstairs, shaking. I stayed awake until sunrise. The next day, I called my parents and told them about the knocking and the footprints. They were concerned, but they said it was probably just the wind or an animal somehow tracking in mud. My mom suggested maybe the window hadn't been fully latched. I didn't argue, but I knew what I'd seen. By the third night, I was a wreck. I barely ate, and my hands wouldn't stop trembling. I turned on every light in the house and kept the TV on for background noise, but around midnight, the power went out. All at once, the house went pitch black. The only sound was the storm raging outside and the faint ticking of the clock in the hall. I grabbed my phone to use the flashlight and checked the breaker. Everything looked fine. When I came back into the kitchen, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The side door, the same one where I'd heard the knocking, was open. Not wide, just enough for the rain to blow in, leaving a thin puddle on the tile. I slammed it shut and locked it, then turned around and froze. There were wet footprints leading across the kitchen floor. Fresh ones. They stopped halfway to the stairs. I backed away slowly, my mind spinning, every nerve in my body screaming to get out. Then from upstairs came a sound that made my blood run cold. It was laughter. Not loud, just a low, breathy chuckle that seemed to echo down the staircase. My vision tunneled. I bolted for the front door, yanking it open and running barefoot into the rain. I didn't stop up until I reached Jason's house 3 blocks away. When I finally told him what happened, he thought I was joking at first. But when he saw how pale I was, he called the police. They came, checked the house top to bottom. They found the footprints. They also found that the back window in the laundry room had been pried open from the outside, but whoever had done it was gone. When my parents came home the next day, I refused to stay there. I stayed at a friend's house for the rest of the week. My dad replaced the locks, installed cameras, and even put bars on some of the windows. For a while, things were quiet again. Then, about 2 weeks later, my mom called me into the kitchen. She was pale, holding one of the printed security camera photos from the new system. "Look," she said, voice shaking. The picture showed the side of our house, taken around midnight. A figure was standing by the kitchen door, a tall man in a dark jacket, his face barely visible, head tilted toward the window. The timestamp read, 12:48 a.m. The night I had run out into the rain. The police never found him. They thought maybe he'd been hiding in the woods nearby, watching houses, waiting for people to leave or fall asleep. But every time I think about those muddy footprints, how they stopped halfway to the stairs, I get sick. Because it means whoever was in my house that night had stopped moving. Not because they left, but because they were listening. Listening to me creeping toward the stairs. Listening as I stood there, frozen in the dark, thinking I was alone. And sometimes, when I lie awake at night in my new apartment, I still hear it. The same slow knocking, faint and steady, like it's coming from inside the walls. Story, the end. It was late November when my parents decided to spend a long weekend at my aunt's lake cabin. I was 18, just old enough to convince them I could handle staying home alone. Our house sat at the edge of a small town in Pennsylvania, quiet, surrounded by trees, and a good 10-minute walk from the nearest neighbor. I'd always liked that isolation. It felt peaceful. But that weekend, it didn't. The first night went as expected. I microwaved some leftover lasagna, scrolled through my phone, and played video games until 1 a.m. When I finally decided to go to bed, the wind outside had picked up, rattling the old windows. I brushed my teeth, turned off the lights, and crawled under the covers. For a while, the sound of the wind was soothing. But around 2 a.m., I woke up to something else, a soft, dragging sound coming from the side of the house. It was faint, almost like someone was sliding their hand along the siding. I held my breath and listened. It stopped for a few seconds, then started again, long, slow drags, followed by a dull thud. I sat up, heart hammering. I told myself it was a branch brushing against the wall, maybe being pushed by the wind. But the sound wasn't random, it was steady, deliberate, like someone pacing along the wall. I got up and looked through my blinds. The yard was dark except for the pale glow of the streetlight down the road. The trees swayed in the wind, but there was no one there. I told myself to calm down and went back to bed, but it took me hours to fall asleep again. The next morning, I checked the side of the house where I'd heard the noise. There weren't any branches near the wall, but the paint was scuffed in a few places. Thin, uneven marks that almost looked like scratches. I crouched to look closer and saw something that made my stomach twist. Faint fingerprints smeared into the dirt on the siding. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a raccoon? Maybe a delivery guy brushed up against the wall somehow? I convinced myself it wasn't worth worrying about. I went about my day, watched TV, called my girlfriend, and tried to ignore how quiet the house felt without anyone else in it. By nightfall, though, that quiet became heavy. The house creaked more than usual. Every shadow seemed sharper. Around 10:30 p.m., as I was scrolling on my phone, the motion light above the garage flicked on. I froze. That light only came on when something passed directly in front of the sensor. I turned off my phone and listened. The wind had died completely. The night was still. Then, I heard the sound again, that same slow, dragging noise, this time closer. It circled the back of the house. I felt my chest tighten as I tiptoed into the kitchen. The window above the sink looked out over the backyard. I hesitated before peeking through the blinds. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then the motion light flickered again, and I saw movement. Someone walking along the fence line. They were tall, wearing something dark, maybe a hoodie. I couldn't see a face. They stopped near the back gate and stood perfectly still. The light clicked off, and the figure disappeared into darkness. I backed away from the window, shaking. I didn't know what to do. Call the police? It felt stupid. They hadn't done anything illegal yet. But when I looked again, the motion light clicked on for the third time. This time I saw a shape moving toward the house. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My voice trembled as I told the dispatcher what was happening. She told me to stay inside, lock all doors, and wait for an officer. I checked every lock twice. Scout wasn't there that weekend. My parents had taken her. I wished more than anything that she was. The dispatcher kept talking to me, trying to keep me calm. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then there was a knock on the back door. Slow, firm, 3 knocks. "Hello?" a deep voice called. "Hey, I think your garage light's messed up." My breath caught. I didn't recognize the voice. It sounded calm, almost casual, but something about it felt wrong. Too rehearsed, too steady. I didn't move. "Can you open up?" the voice asked again. I stayed silent. After a long pause, the knocking started again, harder this time. Then I heard it, faintly, the sound of the doorknob rattling. My stomach dropped. I whispered into the phone, "He's trying to get in." The dispatcher said officers were minutes away. I crouched behind the counter, gripping a kitchen knife, praying I wouldn't hear glass breaking. The rattling stopped. Then, faint footsteps moved toward the front of the house. For a moment, everything was silent again. Then came a loud bang, someone trying the front door. The knob turned. The door shook. I screamed. Within seconds, I heard sirens in the distance. Whoever it was must have heard them too, because the banging stopped. I ran to the window in time to see the motion light flash on one last time, and the figure sprinting down the driveway into the woods. When the police arrived, they searched the property but didn't find anyone. They checked for footprints and found a clear set near the back door, large boots, the kind used for work or hiking. The officer told me it was probably a burglar who got spooked. "You did the right thing," he said. They stayed until my uncle arrived to spend the night with me. I tried to sleep, but even with someone else there, every sound made me flinch. The next morning, I noticed something the police had missed. On the back door, below the handle, there was a small scrape in the wood, like a blade had been jammed between the door and the frame. Someone had tried to pry it open. That realization stayed with me. The police never caught anyone. My parents came home 2 days later, terrified but thankful I was okay. They replaced all the locks and installed cameras around the house. For a few weeks, everything felt normal again. The footage showed nothing unusual, no motion alerts, no strange figures. I started to relax, but then, one night in December, around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the backyard camera. Half asleep, I opened the feed and froze. There, in the grainy night vision footage, was the same figure from before, standing near the fence. He wasn't moving, just staring directly at the camera. He stayed there for almost 2 minutes before walking backward into the woods. The police reviewed the footage, but said it wasn't clear enough to identify anyone. They increased patrols in the area, but nothing came of it. Whoever he was careful. Even now, years later, I can still remember that footage. The way he stood there, motionless, expressionless, staring straight at the lens. I moved out the following summer, but sometimes when I visit my parents, I feel that same unease at night. The motion light will flicker for no reason, or I'll hear a faint scratching against the siding. Every time I look out the window, half expecting to see him there again, standing in the dark, waiting. Story, the end. It was mid-January in Indiana, the kind of freezing night where the air itself felt sharp. My parents were away for the weekend, visiting my older brother in college. I was 19, home alone in our 2-story house at the edge of town. The nearest neighbor was half a mile down the road, and the woods behind our property stretched for acres. I wasn't nervous about being alone. I had done it before. But that weekend, something felt off from the very beginning. The first night started quietly. I made myself some pasta, turned on the fireplace, and settled in to watch a movie. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows occasionally, and the house made its usual creaks. It was peaceful, almost cozy. Around 10 p.m., I let our dog Luna out into the backyard. She was a husky mix, smart and energetic, but that night she refused to go far from the porch. She stood there stiffly, staring into the dark tree line. "Go on, Luna," I said. She didn't move. Instead, her fur bristled, and she let out a low growl. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it toward the woods, but the beam barely cut through the fog rolling in from the fields. I didn't see anything, just the silhouettes of the trees swaying. I brought Luna back inside, locking the door behind me. I figured maybe a coyote was out there. I wasn't scared, just uneasy. Around midnight, I went upstairs. As I was brushing my teeth, I heard what sounded like footsteps on the porch outside. Slow, heavy, measured. I froze, toothbrush in hand, listening. Then came the sound of the door handle turning. Luna started barking from downstairs, sharp and frantic. I dropped everything and ran down, my heart pounding. I checked the front door. Locked. The back door, locked. I peeked through the blinds, but the porch light was out. The moment I looked, the handle jiggled again, harder this time. Someone was definitely out there. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound confident. The movement stopped. Silence. I stood there for what felt like forever, the only sound my own breathing and Luna growling softly beside me. After a minute, I called the police. They said they'd send a unit to drive by. 20 minutes later, they arrived, scanned the area, and found nothing. Not even footprints in the snow. They told me to stay inside and lock everything. I nodded, embarrassed, but also unsettled. After they left, I double-checked every window and door again. Everything was secure. I went to bed around 2 a.m., exhausted, but the feeling of being watched lingered. At some point during the night, I woke up to a faint tapping sound. It was rhythmic, like fingernails against glass. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I realized it was coming from my bedroom window. I slowly turned my head toward it, barely breathing. The tapping stopped. Then slowly, I saw a shape outside, someone standing there, tall, still watching. The porch light didn't reach that far, but I could see the outline of a head and shoulders. I froze completely, unable to move or even blink. Luna started barking downstairs again, her growl deep and guttural. I blinked once, and the shape was gone. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I checked the snow beneath my window. There were footprints. Large, deep prints leading from the edge of the woods to right below my window, then back again. I called the police again, showed them the prints, and they agreed someone had been there. They told me to keep my doors locked and lights on at night. They offered to patrol the area again that evening. That night, I turned on every light in the house. I even kept the TV on in the living room for background noise. I tried to focus on a movie, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from outside. Luna sat in front of the sliding glass door, staring into the darkness. Around 9:30 p.m., she started growling again, low and constant. "Luna, come here," I said softly. She didn't move. Then the motion light in the backyard flicked on. My stomach dropped. I turned off the TV and crept toward the glass door, my heart hammering. The light illuminated the yard, and for just a second, I saw someone standing at the edge of the woods, not moving, just watching. I blinked, and they were gone. I called the police again, but before they could arrive, something hit the side of the house. Hard, like a body slamming into the wall. Luna barked like crazy, running from window to window. Then the banging came again, from the back this time. I turned off all the lights and crouched behind the couch, clutching my phone. The pounding stopped suddenly. Then, from the hallway upstairs, I heard floorboards creak. My blood went cold. There was no way anyone could have gotten inside. Every door was locked, every window shut. But the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps moved from one room to another above me. I whispered to the 911 operator, "They're inside. Please hurry." The operator told me to stay hidden and stay quiet. I could hear Luna whining now, backing away from the stairs. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped at the top of the stairs. I could see the faint outline of someone standing there, a shadow against the dim light from the kitchen. Then they spoke, a deep, gravelly voice. "Why did you lock me out?" I nearly dropped the phone. My whole body went numb. The voice didn't sound angry. It sounded hurt, confused. The police sirens echoed in the distance, and the shadow disappeared instantly. When the police arrived, they searched the entire house, attic, basement, everywhere. Nothing. Not a single sign of forced entry. But they did find something in the snow outside. Footprints again. This time, the prints circled the entire house over and over. After that night, I couldn't be alone there anymore. I stayed with friends until my parents returned. When they got back, my dad found something strange on the porch. A muddy handprint on the glass door. Large. Smudged. Too high up to be mine. We installed new locks, motion cameras, and lights, but none of it helped. For the next week, every night at exactly 12:15, the motion lights in the backyard would flicker on. We checked the footage, nothing there, just the light turning on by itself. On the fourth night, I stayed awake, watching the live feed from my phone. 12:15 hit. The light came on. The camera glitched for half a second, and when it came back, there was someone, standing at the edge of the woods. It was blurry, distorted, but I could make out the shape of a man. Tall, barefoot, head tilted slightly, as if watching the house. Then he lifted his hand and waved. I dropped the phone. We moved out 3 weeks later. My parents didn't argue. My mom had started hearing things too, knocking sounds late at night, whispers through the vents. We sold the house that spring. A few months later, I got a call from the new owners. The husband said he wanted to ask if we'd ever had issues with the backyard motion lights. He said they'd been turning on every night around the same time, even when nothing was there. I didn't know what to say. I just told him it sometimes happened when it was windy. But as I hung up, I remembered the voice I'd heard that night, the one that whispered from the stairs. "Why did you lock me out?" Now, years later, I still dream about that house. In my dreams, I'm back in my old room, the cold light from the backyard spilling through the window, and I can hear the tapping start again. 3 slow taps against the glass, followed by that same quiet voice. "Let me in." Story the end. It was early November when it happened, a Friday night that started out perfectly normal. My parents had gone to visit my grandmother in Ohio for the weekend, leaving me in charge of the house for 2 nights. I was 18, old enough, responsible enough, and honestly, excited to have the place to myself for the first time. Our home was in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Kansas City, surrounded by big maple trees and long stretches of empty street at night. The kind of area where everyone knew each other and nothing bad ever happened. At least that's what I believed before that weekend. I remember the exact time things started to feel wrong. It was 9:47 p.m. I was lying on the couch, half asleep, watching reruns of The Office. The only light came from the TV flickering against the living room walls. I was scrolling through my phone when I heard a faint knock. It wasn't loud, barely noticeable, but it was there. I turned the volume down and listened. Nothing. The wind was howling outside, shaking the trees, and I figured maybe it was just a branch tapping the window. But then it came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I froze. It sounded like it came from the back door. I didn't move at first, just sat there holding my breath, staring toward the dark hallway that led to the kitchen. I told myself it could be a package delivery or maybe one of the neighbors. But who knocks on the back door at nearly 10 at night? After a few seconds, I stood up, grabbed my phone, and crept toward the kitchen. The floorboards creaked softly under my feet. The only sound besides that was the wind outside. I turned on the small kitchen light over the sink and glanced at the back door. The curtain covering the glass pane was swaying slightly, but no one was there. I stared at that door for a long time, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then, just as I was about to turn away, something tapped the glass. Not a knock this time, a tap. Slow, deliberate, like the tip of a fingernail. I stumbled backward, my hand tightening around my phone. The curtain still swayed gently, but I could see a faint shape behind it, someone standing just outside. My stomach dropped. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The tapping came again, softer this time. Then whoever it was spoke. "Hey!" A low voice whispered, muffled through the glass. "You forgot to lock it." I ran. I didn't even think. I bolted up the stairs, slammed my bedroom door shut, and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped my phone twice before dialing 911. The dispatcher answered immediately, calm and steady, but I could barely form words. "There's someone at my house," I whispered, "at the back door." She asked if the person had tried to enter. I told her what I heard, that they said I forgot to lock it. She told me to stay on the line and stay where I was. Officers were on the way. I sat there, pressed against my door, listening to the silence below. Then I heard it, the faint creak of the back door opening. I hadn't checked if it was locked. My heart sank as I realized maybe he was right. The footsteps that followed were soft, cautious, almost methodical. Whoever was down there was trying not to be heard. I could picture it, someone moving slowly through the kitchen, maybe crouched low, waiting. The dispatcher kept talking, telling me help was coming, but her voice felt far away. I could hear drawers being opened downstairs, the soft scrape of metal, the sound of something being set on the counter. Then footsteps again, moving toward the stairs. I whispered into the phone, "He's inside." The dispatcher told me to stay quiet, to hide if possible. But I couldn't move. I just sat there frozen as the footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. Then a few seconds later, creak. One step, another. The sound of slow, deliberate movement up the stairs. I held my breath. Every step sounded heavier, closer. I could see the faint line of light under my door, and then shadows moved across it. Someone was standing right outside. There was a long pause. Then, quietly, the doorknob turned. I couldn't help it. I let out a small sound, a gasp. The turning stopped. The silence after that was worse than the noise. I waited, shaking uncontrollably as seconds crawled by. Then, faintly, I heard whispering through the door. I couldn't make out the words, just a low, rasping murmur that made my skin crawl. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I waited, terrified, not knowing if he was still there. Then I heard it, the faint sound of sirens in the distance. The shadow under the door moved away. The footsteps went back down the stairs. I heard the front door open and slam shut. When the police arrived, I was still in the corner of my room, clutching the phone. They swept through the house, weapons drawn, shouting commands. I didn't come out until one of the officers came upstairs and told me it was safe. They found muddy footprints in the kitchen, leading from the back door to the front. The curtain on the back door had a small tear in it, like someone had pulled it aside to look in. But nothing was stolen. Nothing was broken. Whoever it was hadn't taken anything, just wandered through my house in the dark. The officers said the back door latch had been damaged. It hadn't been locked. They took my statement, checked the perimeter, and left. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every light in the house on. Every sound made me flinch. When morning came, I packed a bag and went to my friend Connor's house, too scared to be alone. For the rest of the weekend, nothing else happened. When my parents came home Sunday night, I told them everything. My dad was furious that I hadn't checked the locks properly. My mom tried to reassure me, saying maybe it was some drunk neighbor or a prank, but the police had said the footprints led into the woods behind our house, where there were no other homes nearby. A few days later, something even stranger happened. I came home from school to find a small, folded note taped to the inside of my bedroom window. The paper was old and creased, like it had been carried around for a while. My name was written on it in messy handwriting. Inside it said, "You locked it this time." My stomach dropped. I ran out of the room and called the police again. When they came, they checked the window. It was locked, no sign of forced entry. No prints. They had no explanation for how the note got there. That night, I slept in my parents' room with the door locked. I kept hearing things, faint thumps from the attic, scratching along the walls. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew the feeling was real. The house didn't feel safe anymore. A few nights later, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound that made my blood run cold. The squeak of the back door. Again. I froze, listening. It creaked once, then stopped. I could hear faint breathing, slow and steady, from somewhere down the hall. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I could feel it, that unmistakable sense of someone standing close, watching. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The breathing went on for a few seconds, then faded. When I finally turned on the lamp, there was no one there. But I noticed something on the floor by the door, a wet footprint. Bare. The police came again the next day, but they found nothing new. After that, my parents installed new locks, cameras, motion lights, everything they could think of. But none of it made me feel better, because whoever had been in that house wasn't trying to steal anything. They just wanted me to know they could get in. It's been years since then, but I still remember that voice. Low, calm, almost polite. "You forgot to lock it." Now, every night, before I go to bed, I check every door and window twice, sometimes 3 times, because even though we moved to a new house miles away, sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night. Sure, I can hear that soft tapping on the glass and a voice whispering from the dark, reminding me, "You locked it this time." Story the end. It was a Saturday night in late October, the kind of night when the wind blows cold through the empty streets and the leaves scatter like restless spirits. I was 22, living alone in my parents' old house in a small town outside of Indianapolis. My parents had gone out of state for a wedding, leaving me home alone for the first time in years. The house was big, older, with creaky floors and narrow hallways. I'd grown up here, so I knew every corner, every squeak, every drafty window. Usually that knowledge was comforting. That night, it wasn't. I spent the evening making dinner and watching TV. Around 9:30, I went upstairs to get ready for bed. Before shutting off the lights, I checked the locks. Front door, back door, windows. Everything was secure. I told myself I'd be fine. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of something moving downstairs. It was subtle at first, a soft scraping noise like someone dragging their shoes along the hardwood floor. I froze, straining to listen. The house was otherwise silent except for the wind rattling the trees outside. I told myself it was probably just the house settling. Old houses make noises. Then it happened again. Closer this time. Step, pause, deliberate and slow. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I grabbed my phone and tried to turn on the flashlight without making any sound. The beam lit up the hallway outside my room. Empty. I listened. The steps stopped. I told myself I was imagining it and forced myself to calm down. Slowly, I got out of bed and crept to the staircase. I peeked over the railing into the living room. Nothing. Then I saw it, movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow near the kitchen doorway just flickering, like someone stepping into and out of the faint light from the street lamps outside. I froze. My phone slipped in my hand. The shadow moved again, then vanished behind the wall. I backed away, trying not to make a sound. That's when I heard it, a low whisper, almost too quiet to make out. "I see you." My blood ran cold. That wasn't the wind. That wasn't a settling house. Someone was inside my home. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept in the corner and dialed 911, whispering into the phone. The operator instructed me to stay put and keep quiet, assuring me officers were on the way. The whisper came again, closer this time, right outside my bedroom door. "Come out!" The doorknob rattled, soft but deliberate. Someone was testing it. I pressed my back against the wall, bat in hand, listening to the slow creaks of footsteps pacing the hallway. The air grew colder, like a heavy draft had moved through the room, and the faint smell of something metallic drifted in. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. I couldn't tell. Then the footsteps receded, moving back toward the living room. I dared a glance at the door. The shadow under it hadn't moved. I stayed crouched in my room, whispering updates to the dispatcher. Then came the sound from downstairs. A thud. Harder this time, like something heavy had fallen. Followed by a soft scrape across the floor. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. Finally, sirens pierced the night. Relief washed over me, but the fear didn't let go. Police officers stormed the house, guns drawn, shouting commands as they cleared each room. They found nothing. No forced entry, no stolen items. The back door was locked. Windows all secure. The place was empty. When they asked if I'd seen anyone, I told them about the shadow, the whispers, the footsteps. They looked skeptical, but documented everything. A week later, I returned home with my parents. The house was silent again. Nothing felt out of place, except on the living room floor near the kitchen, where faint, muddy footprints appeared overnight. Small, bare prints leading from the hallway to the kitchen, then ending abruptly, as if the person simply vanished. We never found out who or what was in the house that night. Even now, years later, whenever I sleep alone, I hear it sometimes, the faintest creak of a floorboard, a whisper just beyond the door, and that feeling that someone is standing in the shadows, watching. And I know they'll always be out there, waiting. Story the end. It was the middle of July, and the heat was unbearable even at night. My parents had gone to visit my aunt in Chicago for the weekend, leaving me alone in our small 2-story home in a quiet town in Missouri. I was 21, just working part-time at a local hardware store, and I'd promised them I'd be fine staying by myself. It wasn't the first time I'd been home alone, but something about that weekend felt different from the start. The first night was fine. I made dinner, watched some shows, and stayed up late scrolling through my phone. Around midnight, I went upstairs to bed. I left my bedroom window open because the air conditioner was broken and the night breeze was the only thing keeping me from sweating through the sheets. I fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the occasional passing car. Sometime after 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. The air felt different, heavier. I remember lying there, staring at the ceiling, like trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it. A faint, slow creak from downstairs. It wasn't the kind of creak the house made when it settled. It was rhythmic, like someone taking careful steps on the hardwood floor. I froze. For a full minute, I listened. Nothing. Then another sound, the soft click of the back door. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I knew I'd locked that door before going upstairs. I always did. I slowly sat up, listening again. The footsteps started moving, this time toward the living room. Slow. Deliberate. Whoever it was wasn't trying to be quiet. They were taking their time. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but my hand was shaking so badly that I dropped it. It clattered onto the floor, loud enough to echo down the hallway. The footsteps stopped. My heart dropped into my stomach. Whoever was downstairs had heard me. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. For a long, horrible minute, everything was dead silent. Then the footsteps started again, this time coming toward the stairs. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My voice shook as I whispered to the operator that someone was in my house. She told me to stay quiet, stay hidden, and that officers were on the way. The creaking steps on the stairs were slow, one, then another. Whoever it was wasn't rushing. They were savoring it. I could hear the faint rasp of their shoes against the wood, the sound of slow breathing as they reached the top. I crawled out of bed and ducked into my closet, shutting the door as quietly as I could. My phone screen glowed faintly in the dark, and I pressed it against my chest to hide the light. The operator's voice whispered through the speaker asking if I was safe. I didn't dare answer. Then, through the slats in the closet door, I saw a shadow move past my bedroom doorway. Tall, thin. Paused for a moment, then turned toward the window. My window, the one I'd left open. The figure stood there for what felt like forever, just breathing. I could see the faint outline of a head moving slowly, as if they were looking around. Then they walked over to my bed. I heard the sheets rustle, the sound of slow breathing just feet from where I was hiding. Then a sound that made my blood run cold, a low chuckle. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, the kind of laugh someone lets out when they know exactly how scared you are. I could hear him whisper something under his breath, but it was too quiet to make out. Then I saw him bend down, as if looking under the bed. I thought for sure he'd look toward the closet next, but he didn't. Instead, he stood up, turned, and walked slowly back out of the room. I waited another full minute, my entire body trembling, before whispering to the operator that he was upstairs. She told me the police were just pulling into the neighborhood. Then I heard it. The front door again. A loud creak, followed by the sound of it slamming shut. The house went silent. The police arrived moments later. 2 officers swept through the house with flashlights, checking every room, every corner. They found the back door wide open, the lock pried apart. No one else was inside. They asked me to describe what I'd seen, but I could barely talk. They stayed for over an hour, checking the windows and yard. When they left, they told me to keep everything locked and call if I noticed anything else unusual. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch until sunrise, the baseball bat across my lap, every light in the house turned on. The next morning, I found something that made me sick to my stomach. On the windowsill of my open bedroom window, there were smudged fingerprints, large ones, greasy, like someone had been holding onto the frame to pull themselves inside. But that wasn't the worst part. In the dirt outside the window, just below the sill, were footprints, bare, large. They led from the window to the tree line behind the house and disappeared into the woods. The police came back when I called them. They found the prints too, but no trail beyond that. The officer said it could have been a vagrant, someone who saw an open window and took advantage of it, maybe someone passing through. But the prints, bare, deep, and clear, didn't look like someone who was just wandering. That day, I had the locks changed and bought new window latches. I stayed with a friend for the next few nights until my parents came back. I didn't tell them everything, just that someone tried to break in. I didn't tell them about the breathing, the laugh, the way he seemed to stand there, just watching in ways as if he was enjoying every second. I tried to forget it, and for a while, I did. Months passed. I even stopped checking the windows every night before bed. Then one humid night in August, I came home from work late. It was nearly midnight. And as I stepped inside, I noticed something strange. The air in the house was still, too still. The lights flickered once when I turned them on, like the power had been cut and reconnected. I walked to the kitchen to get a drink, and that's when I saw it, something taped to the outside of the back door window. It was a Polaroid photo of me, asleep in my bed. My heart nearly stopped. I pulled it down with trembling hands and stared at it. The angle was from inside the room, facing my bed. The timestamp in the corner said July 15th, the first night I'd been home alone. I called the police again. They came, checked the house, top to bottom, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no new footprints, no one nearby. The detective who took the photo as evidence told me it was possible the intruder had taken it before the police arrived that first night, while I was still asleep. He said maybe the man had been in the house longer than I realized. That thought alone nearly broke me. I moved out less than a month later into an apartment downtown with a roommate. I haven't stayed alone in a house since. Every once in a while, though, when I'm lying in bed late at night and the city goes quiet, I think I can still hear that slow creaking sound of footsteps on wooden stairs, and I wonder if he ever really left. Story the end. It was the middle of winter when my parents went on a weekend trip to visit my uncle in Denver. I was 22, living at home while finishing school online, and they trusted me enough to take care of the house for a few days. We lived just outside of Omaha in a quiet cul-de-sac where nothing bad ever really happened. Everyone knew everyone, and the neighborhood was the kind of place where people left their porch lights on and waved to each other every evening. The house felt enormous once they left Friday morning. My dad's truck was gone, my mom's perfume no longer hung in the hallway, and the only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak from the old wood floors. I liked the quiet at first. I planned on ordering Chinese food, playing some games, maybe staying up late to watch a movie. That night, around 11 p.m., I sat on the couch with a plate of lo mein, watching a horror movie. Ironic, looking back now, The wind was sharp outside, brushing against the windows. I remember thinking how nice it felt to be inside, warm and safe, while it howled outside. About halfway through the movie, Bailey, our golden retriever, lifted her head and stared toward the front window. Her ears perked, tail still, her low growl rumbling deep in her chest. "What is it?" I asked softly. She didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the dark space between the blinds. I turned down the volume and listened. At first I didn't hear anything. Then 3 faint taps, slow, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, looking at the window. The sound came again, a little louder this time. Bailey growled louder, moving toward the front door. I stood up and peeked through the peephole. The porch light was on, but no one was there. Just the empty driveway, our snow-covered yard, and the shadow of the big oak tree swaying across the porch. "Probably the wind," I whispered, but I didn't really believe it. I locked the door again and went back to the couch. For a while, everything was quiet. Then, maybe 20 minutes later, Bailey jumped off the couch and sprinted toward the kitchen. I followed her, my heart pounding. She was standing near the back door, barking furiously at the sliding glass window that looked out onto the deck. I turned on the porch light. The deck was empty. Snowflakes fell slowly under the light, and everything looked calm. Then I noticed it, the footprints. 2 clear sets of footprints in the snow, leading from the trees in our backyard straight up to the deck. Bare feet. No shoes. I called out without thinking, "Hello?" The sound of my voice in that still house made my stomach turn. No answer, of course. Just the faint rattle of the wind. I locked the door, drew the blinds, and called the non-emergency police line. An officer came out about 20 minutes later. He checked around, saw the prints, and said they looked a little weird. But since there was no sign of forced entry or damage, there wasn't much he could do. He said it was probably some kid messing around, maybe a drunk from the next neighborhood over. He promised to patrol the area that night. That reassurance didn't help much. I slept downstairs on the couch that night with all the lights on. Bailey lay across my feet, growling softly at random intervals. I finally dozed off around 3 a.m. I woke up at 4:12 to the sound of the floor creaking upstairs. My blood ran cold. I wasn't dreaming. I could hear distinct footsteps. Slow, heavy steps. Not the random settling sounds of an old house. Someone was up there. I held my breath, frozen on the couch, afraid to move. Bailey was alert, her head up, ears twitching, but she didn't bark, just stared toward the stairs. The sound stopped for a moment, then another step. Another. I grabbed my phone, dialed 911, and whispered into it. The operator told me to stay quiet and get out if I could, but I couldn't move. The only way out was past the stairs. Then the footsteps started down. One creak. Another. Slow. Deliberate. Bailey finally barked, loud and sharp, and the footsteps stopped. Dead silent. Then, faster this time, the sound of someone running back up the stairs. The thudding echoed through the house. I bolted for the front door, still clutching my phone, Bailey right behind me. I didn't even stop to put on shoes. The police arrived within minutes. They went inside, weapons drawn, and cleared the entire house. Every room, every closet. No one was there. But the upstairs window in my parents' bedroom was open, just slightly. Snow had blown in, melting into the carpet. The officer said it looked like someone had climbed in and out. I couldn't breathe when I saw it. They found footprints outside, circling the house. The same bare feet as before, long, narrow prints pressed into the snow, leading from the woods, around the house, then back again. I stayed with a neighbor that night. I didn't go back inside until morning, after the sun came up. The house felt wrong. The air was heavy, and the shadows seemed to stick in the corners longer than they should have. I went to clean the melted snow near my parents' bedroom window and noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the dresser, next to my mom's jewelry box, was a Polaroid photo. I picked it up, and my hands started shaking. It was a picture of me, sleeping on the couch the night before. In the photo, the light from the TV illuminated my face. Bailey was curled up at my feet, and in the reflection of the darkened window behind me, faint but unmistakable, was a tall figure standing just a few feet away, watching. I dropped the photo and ran outside, shaking so hard I could barely breathe. The police came again, took the picture, and told me someone must have broken in earlier, while I'd taken Bailey out and hidden inside the house. They thought he took the photo before I woke up, then escaped through the window. But that didn't explain the second set of footsteps that came down the stairs. It didn't explain how the footprints outside led to the window, but not away from it. I stayed with friends for the rest of the weekend. My parents came back early, horrified by what had happened. My dad installed new locks, cameras, motion lights, everything. The camera footage from that weekend showed nothing out of the ordinary until the very last night. Around 3 a.m., one of the backyard cameras flickered on for just a few seconds. It captured a shadow moving at the edge of the woods. The figure stood perfectly still facing the house. Then, slowly, it lifted an arm and waved. The screen glitched and went black. They never found anyone. It's been over a year now, but I still can't sleep in that house when I'm alone. Sometimes, even in my apartment across town, I wake up in the middle of the night and think I hear footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate, familiar. And every so often when I glance out my window at night, I swear I see a shadow standing across the street, motionless, watching. Story, the end. It was mid-October, the kind of cool, dry night that makes the air feel sharp when you breathe. I was 23 then, living alone for the first time in my life in a small one-bedroom house outside of Madison, Wisconsin. It sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, with nothing but woods behind it. I'd rented the place because it was cheap and quiet, the kind of solitude I thought I needed after a messy breakup and years of roommates. For the first couple of months, I loved it. I'd come home from work, make dinner, sit on the couch with my dog, and enjoy the silence. No traffic, no neighbors yelling through the walls, just wind in the trees and the occasional sound of an owl. That October, though, I started to notice strange things. It began one night when I was sitting on the couch watching a show around 10 p.m. The living room window faced the gravel driveway, and I could see the faint reflection of the porch light bouncing off the glass. Out of nowhere, my dog, Cooper, lifted his head and started growling deep and low. He stared toward the window, ears up, eyes fixed. I muted the TV. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then came the crunch of gravel. Not the kind of sound a car makes. This was slower, a steady, deliberate rhythm like someone walking. I got up, looked through the blinds, and saw nothing. The driveway was empty, the trees still. But Cooper wouldn't stop growling. He paced near the door, tail low, body tense. Probably a deer, I told him, though I didn't sound convinced. I stepped outside with a flashlight and scanned the driveway. The beam stretched out into the dark, catching bits of dust and leaves, but no movement. I walked halfway down the drive before stopping. The woods on both sides were black and endless. I stood there for a while, listening. Nothing. Just as I was turning to go back, I heard a soft crack, the sound of a branch snapping deep in the trees. I swung the flashlight in that direction, but it only lit up more darkness. My pulse was thudding in my ears by then. I muttered a shaky hello and waited, but no one answered. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to convince myself it was just an animal. That night I barely slept. Cooper kept pacing around, whining occasionally, and every time I started to drift off, some sound outside would jolt me awake. A rustle, a creak, or something scraping lightly against the siding. By morning, I told myself I'd overreacted. I even laughed about it when I got to work. But that night, it happened again. This time, the noise came from the back of the house, the side that faced the woods. I was in the kitchen when I heard what sounded like someone brushing against the wall. I turned off the light, stood still, and listened. Scrape. Then, again, louder. It wasn't an animal. It sounded deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and, against every instinct, went to the back door. I flicked on the porch light, and the second I did, the noise stopped. The light revealed nothing but empty grass and trees swaying in the wind. I shut the door, locked it, and sat there for a long time. Eventually, I called a friend, told him I thought someone might be messing around my property. He offered to come over, but I said no. It was late, and I didn't want to sound paranoid. But the next morning, I found something made my blood run cold. In the dew on the back door's glass panel, there was a faint handprint. Not smudged from inside. This one was outside. Large. Distinct. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach churning. I told myself it could have been there for a while. Maybe a delivery guy, maybe even me from the day I moved in. I tried to believe that. But later that afternoon, when I checked again, the print was gone, like someone had wiped it off. That night, I didn't even try to watch TV. I locked every door, every window, drew the blinds, and sat on the couch with the lights off, listening. Around midnight, Cooper started whining at the front door again. His nails scratched the floor as he backed up, then barked once. Short, sharp, scared. I grabbed the flashlight and looked through the peephole. There was someone standing at the edge of the driveway, a tall figure barely visible under the dim glow of the porch light, just standing there, facing the house. I froze. They didn't move, not for a long time. I stood there, gripping the doorframe, heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. After maybe 30 seconds, the person turned and walked slowly toward the woods. That night, I called the sheriff's department. They sent a deputy who searched the area but found nothing. He said it was probably a hunter who got lost, or maybe a trespasser cutting through. He promised to have patrols swing by more often. For a few days, everything was quiet again. I started to relax, though I still slept with the lights on. Then, about a week later, I came home from work and noticed something strange. The side gate to my backyard was open. I never left it open. It led directly to the woods, and I always made sure to keep it latched. I walked out there slowly, every nerve in my body screaming to turn back. The gate creaked softly in the breeze. There were footprints in the dirt. Big ones, boot prints, leading from the woods to my back door and then back into the trees again. I called the police immediately. When the deputy arrived, he crouched down to look and said the prints looked fresh. He asked if anyone else had access to the property. I said no. He searched the woods for nearly an hour before returning. Nothing. That night, I packed a bag and stayed at a friend's apartment in town. I didn't sleep much, and I kept checking the security camera app on my phone, the one linked to the small cameras I'd installed around the porch a few weeks before. At 2:17 a.m., I got an alert. Motion detected. I opened the live feed, and my heart nearly stopped. The video showed the porch, empty for a second, and then, slowly, a man stepped into view. He was tall, wearing a hooded jacket and gloves, his face hidden. He stood close to the door, staring at it for what felt like forever. Then he leaned in, pressing his hand flat against the glass, just like before. He stayed there for nearly 2 minutes, just breathing, watching. Then, as if he heard something in the distance, he turned and walked off the porch. The next morning, when the police reviewed the footage, they said they couldn't make out the license plate of the vehicle that drove away a few minutes later. Just a dark pickup truck, maybe a Ford, with a missing rear plate light. They told me to stay somewhere else for a while, at least until they could patrol the area more regularly. I never went back to that house after that night. My landlord was understanding enough to let me break the lease. A few weeks later, he called me. He said the new tenants had just moved in, and something strange had happened their first night. They found muddy footprints by the back door and a handprint on the glass. Story the end. It was late October when my parents went to visit my grandmother out of state, leaving me home alone for 2 nights. I was 19 in community college and had the weekend off from work, so they figured I'd be fine. I'd stayed home alone before, plenty of times, but something about that weekend felt different from the start. We lived in a 2-story house on the edge of a small town in Indiana. Behind our backyard stretched a few acres of dense woods. The house was old, creaky, the kind that groaned in the middle of the night and made you wonder if someone was walking upstairs. But I was used to that. The first day was normal. I slept in, made coffee, cleaned up, and spent most of the day watching TV. Around sunset, I noticed the air had changed. The temperature dropped and a fog started to creep in from the woods. I remember standing by the sliding glass door, watching the mist roll across the grass like smoke. It looked eerie, the kind of fog that swallows up everything, making even the yard look endless. By 8 p.m., it was dark and the fog was thick enough that I couldn't see past the porch light. I locked up the doors, turned on a few lamps, and started making dinner. Everything felt calm again until I heard the sound. It was faint, barely audible over the hum of the stove. At first I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was coming from the backyard. A steady, rhythmic click, 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 like something metallic tapping against glass. I turned off the burner and listened. The sound stopped. The house went silent except for the faint buzz of the refrigerator. I went to the sliding glass door and flipped on the backyard light, but all I saw was the thick wall of fog pressing up against the windows. No movement, no reflection, nothing. I stood there for a full minute, waiting, before I shrugged it off and went back to eating. I told myself it was probably a tree branch or the wind knocking something around. Around 10:30, I was upstairs scrolling through my phone when I heard it again, this time louder. The same click, click, click coming from downstairs. It wasn't random anymore. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was dragging a nail along the glass door. I froze, listening. It went on for nearly a minute before stopping abruptly. I crept to the top of the stairs, heart pounding, and leaned over the railing. The downstairs was completely dark, except for the faint orange glow from the lamp in the living room. I could see the reflection of the sliding glass door from where I stood, but the outside was black. I told myself not to be stupid, that it was probably a tree branch, but deep down I knew better. The trees were too far from the house to hit the glass. I slowly walked downstairs, every creak of the steps sounding too loud. When I got to the living room, I turned on the light and faced the door. There was nothing there. But the glass was fogged up, and in the center of it there was something drawn, a handprint. It was large, almost twice the size of mine, smeared as if someone had pressed their palm hard against the glass. My stomach flipped. I checked the lock. It was still secure. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a kitchen knife, and stood there, staring out into the fog, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down. That's when my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from an unknown number. No name, just a single sentence. "Why'd you turn the light on?" I felt every bit of warmth drain from my body. My hands shook as I stared at the screen, reading the message over and over. I immediately texted back, "Who is this?" No response. I tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. My brain was racing. Could it be one of my friends playing a prank? Maybe someone who knew I was home alone? But how would they know about the light? I shut the curtains, checked all the doors again, and went upstairs, locking myself in my room. I turned on the TV for noise, trying to calm down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was outside, watching. Around midnight, I heard the creak of the front porch. Not the wind, definitely footsteps. Slow, heavy ones. I muted the TV, every muscle in my body tightening. The steps went from the porch to the side of the house, crunching in the gravel. Then silence. I grabbed my phone again and called 911. I told the dispatcher someone was outside my house, that I was alone. She said an officer was on the way and to stay inside. She asked if I could see the person. I told her no, it was too dark, too foggy. Then I heard it again. The click. Click, click. But this time, it wasn't coming from the backyard. It was coming from the kitchen window. I tiptoed to the top of the stairs and peeked down. The kitchen was dim, shadows stretching across the floor. I could see a faint movement near the window, a dark shape pressed against the glass. Then the sound of breathing, deep, ragged breathing. I ducked behind the wall, heart hammering in my throat. I could still hear the breathing, faint and uneven. Then a whisper, so soft I could barely make it out. "Let me in." My whole body went cold. I whispered into the phone that he was at the window. The dispatcher told me to stay upstairs, that the police were almost there. I could hear her voice, but it felt distant. My focus was on the sound of the breathing that was now moving around the house. I could hear it brush past the siding, the faint crunch of leaves, then the creak of the back steps. It was circling the house slowly. Then everything went silent. I stayed frozen at the top of the stairs until I heard the faint wail of sirens. I rushed to the window and saw red and blue lights flickering through the fog. The police car stopped at the end of the driveway. 2 officers got out, flashlights cutting through the mist. They checked around the yard first. Then one of them waved at me to come down. I unlocked the door and let them in, my whole body shaking. They searched the house and the yard, but found nothing. No one, no footprints, nothing disturbed. I kept insisting I'd heard someone, that there'd been breathing outside the window, but the officer's expression told me he didn't believe me entirely. Then I remembered the handprint. I took them to the sliding door. The fog had cleared a bit, but the print was still there. Except now there were more. 3 of them, 1 large, 2 smaller, pressed against the glass like someone had been standing there, feeling around. The officer shined his flashlight on it and frowned. "Looks fresh," he said. They checked the yard again, but still found nothing. No tire tracks, no footprints. The fog had swallowed everything. They told me to keep the doors locked and to call if anything else happened. They'd patrol the area for the night. When they left, the house felt emptier than ever. I sat in the living room with every light on, knife still in hand, waiting for morning. Sometime after 3 a.m., I must have dozed off. I woke up to my phone vibrating beside me. Another message from the same number. This one said, "You shouldn't have let them in." My heart nearly stopped. I looked around, every shadow suddenly feeling alive. I called the police again, but before they could arrive, I heard it. Click, click, click. This time, it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the basement. The sound echoed faintly up the vent, rhythmic, metallic. I backed away from the basement door, clicking my phone, whispering to the dispatcher that I could hear him inside the house. She told me to get out, to leave through the front door, and wait for the officers outside. I ran. I didn't stop to look behind me. The cold night air hit my face as I bolted into the driveway. The fog had thinned, and I could see the flashing lights approaching again. When the officers entered the house, they went straight for the basement. They found the window down there shattered, small enough for someone to squeeze through. On the floor were muddy footprints leading across the cement, stopping behind the old furnace. There, wedged in the shadows, they found something that made my stomach twist. A small blanket, a plastic water bottle, an old phone charger plugged into the wall. Someone had been living down there. The police searched the woods for hours that night, but never found the person. They said it might have been a drifter using the basement for shelter. But when I told them about the texts, the handprints, the whisper, they couldn't explain that. The number that had texted me was untraceable. Disconnected. We moved 2 months later. I still can't sleep in silence. I need a fan or some noise to drown out the quiet. Because when it's too still, sometimes I think I can hear it again, faint through the walls. That slow, steady click, 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 like someone's still there waiting. Story the end. It happened in 2021 during one of those long, suffocating stretches of isolation when most people were still working from home. I had just moved into a small 2-story rental house outside of St. Louis. It wasn't fancy, but it had a big yard, old hardwood floors, and plenty of space for one person. My landlord was an older guy who lived out of town and didn't care what I did as long as the rent was on time. It was cheap, quiet, and far enough from the city that you didn't hear traffic, only the sound of crickets at night and the occasional bark of a dog somewhere down the street. The first few weeks were fine. I liked the solitude. My work kept me on the computer all day, and in the evenings I'd cook, listen to music, and sometimes go for short walks before it got dark. The house felt comfortable, safe even. But that comfort didn't last long. It started one Tuesday night in March. I was sitting on the couch watching a movie around 11 when I heard what sounded like footsteps on the porch. Not the heavy thud of boots, but light, slow, measured steps, as if someone was trying to be quiet. I muted the TV and listened. Nothing. I turned the porch light on and looked out the front window. The yard was empty. I figured maybe it was an animal, maybe a raccoon, and went back to my movie. 10 minutes later, the noise came again. But this time, it was at the back of the house, a faint scraping sound like something dragging along the siding. Then, very clearly, 3 taps against the glass of the kitchen window. I froze. My skin prickled, and I could feel the hairs on my arms stand up. I didn't move for a full minute. When I finally worked up the nerve, I crept to the kitchen, keeping the lights off so whoever or whatever was outside couldn't see me. I peeked through the blinds. Nothing, just my own reflection staring back at me. I told myself it was the wind, maybe a branch rubbing the wall, and went to bed. But sleep didn't come easy. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the faint sound of footsteps inside the house. They were soft, deliberate on the hardwood floor downstairs. I held my breath. The sound moved slowly from the living room to the kitchen, then stopped. I sat up, every nerve on fire, listening for any movement. I kept staring at the door, waiting for it to creak open. After what felt like hours, silence. I didn't move until the sun came up. When I finally went downstairs, everything was where I left it. The doors were still locked, the windows closed, no signs of entry. I convinced myself I must have imagined it, that maybe I'd been half dreaming. But then it happened again. The following night, I was brushing my teeth around midnight when I heard a faint tapping sound. Again, 3 slow taps coming from the bathroom window this time. I stood there, toothpaste foaming in my mouth, staring at the fogged-up glass. The blinds were down, but the faint outline of something was visible behind them. A shape. A head. I turned off the light immediately, heart pounding in my chest. The shape didn't move. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering into the receiver that someone was outside my house. The dispatcher told me to stay put and that an officer was on the way. By the time the police arrived, the shape was gone. They checked around the house and found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone being there. The officer, a middle-aged guy who seemed more tired than alarmed, told me it was probably a prank. Could be some local kid messing around, he said. Keep your lights on, and it'll stop. I tried to believe him. 2 nights passed without incident. I slept with every light on, the TV running in the background. But by the 4th night, I noticed something new. The back door lock didn't feel right. It had a little give to it, like it had been forced or tampered with. I checked it again and again, but every time I touched it, it wiggled slightly. I decided to call a locksmith the next morning. That night, I pushed a chair under the doorknob and left the kitchen light on before going upstairs to bed. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound so quiet I almost thought I was dreaming, a faint creak like wood shifting under weight. Then came the sound of slow breathing. Not mine. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The light hit the far corner of the room, and I nearly dropped it. The closet door was open. I knew for a fact I'd closed it before bed. I stared at that dark space, my mind racing. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The air felt thick, heavy. Then something moved inside the closet, just a small, deliberate shuffle, like someone adjusting their footing. I didn't think. I ran out of the room, down the stairs, and out the front door, barefoot and shaking. I called 911 from the driveway, trying to form words. When the police arrived this time, they didn't take their time. 2 officers went inside while I waited in the car. I saw their flashlights moving through the windows, the beams darting from room to room. A few minutes later, one of them came back out and told me they didn't find anyone. But they did find something. In the upstairs closet, they found a pile of clothes, men's clothes, dirty and damp. There was also a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in foil, a bottle of water, and an old blanket. Someone had been living in my house. They guessed he'd been sneaking in through the crawl space that connected the basement to the foundation. There was a small, hidden access panel behind the washer that I'd never noticed before. It led into a narrow space big enough for someone to crawl through, and from there up into the walls and the attic. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even go back inside. The police stayed until morning and helped me gather a few things. I packed my bag and went to stay at a friend's place. A few days later, the landlord called to say he'd had an inspection done. The crawl space had food wrappers, empty water bottles, and footprints. Whoever had been there had been inside for a while. Maybe days, maybe weeks. That should have been the end of it, but 2 weeks after I moved out, I got a call from the same landlord. He sounded shaken. He told me the new tenant moved in and lasted only 1 night. She called him the next morning and said she woke up to the sound of someone whispering from inside the walls. When she went downstairs, the back door was open. The police came again. This time they found muddy footprints leading from the crawl space to the kitchen. Whoever he wasn't gone. He was waiting for someone else to come home. Story the end. It was mid-January in a quiet town in upstate New York. Snow had been falling for hours, the kind that blanketed everything in silence, muting even the faint hum of distant traffic. I was 20 at the time, home alone in my family's 2-story farmhouse while my parents were away visiting relatives in Vermont. They'd left that morning, planning to be gone until Monday, and I remember feeling completely fine about it. I'd lived there all my life, and nothing bad had ever happened in that house. The place sat at the end of a long, winding road lined with bare trees and a few distant houses, none close enough to see clearly at night. It was peaceful, a little eerie at times, but familiar. I planned to spend the weekend catching up on schoolwork, maybe order takeout, and just enjoy the quiet. That first evening was uneventful. I cooked dinner, watched some TV, and played music for a while. Around 11 p.m., I decided to head upstairs to bed. The snow outside reflected enough light that even with the lamps off, I could see the outlines of the furniture as I climbed the stairs. I left the living room lamp on just in case. It always made the house feel less empty. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. The power was still on and the heater was humming quietly, but something had pulled me from sleep. I lay there listening. For a moment, nothing. Then I heard it. A faint creaking sound coming from downstairs. It wasn't the random pop of the wood expanding from the cold. It was deliberate, slow, heavy creaks, like footsteps moving across the old wooden floor. I held my breath. Maybe it was just the house settling. But then I heard it again, this time closer to the base of the stairs. My room was at the top of the steps, and from where I lay, I could see the thin strip of light from the living room lamp cutting across the floor at the bottom. I squinted, trying to see movement. Nothing. I told myself it had to be Max, our neighbor's cat. He sometimes slipped through the side door when it didn't latch properly. That explanation settled my nerves enough to let me roll over and close my eyes. Then came another sound. A tap. Sharp, distinct, followed by another. It was coming from the kitchen window. I sat up in bed, every muscle tensing. The tapping was rhythmic. 2 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. My heart began to race. I got up and walked to the top of the stairs, peering down into the living room. That's when I saw it. The curtain in the kitchen was swaying slightly, like someone had brushed against it. But the air in the house was still. The heat wasn't running just then. I turned on the hall light. The tapping stopped instantly. Silence. I stood there for what felt like forever, gripping the railing, listening. Then, quietly, a new sound began, the faint creak of the back door handle being tested. Not turned all the way, just a small metallic shift, as if someone was slowly trying to see if it was unlocked. That's when my throat went dry. I ran back into my room, shut the door, and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone as I dialed 911. The dispatcher's calm voice grounded me a little, and I told her someone was outside my house, trying the doors. She told me to stay put and that officers were on their way. As I sat there in the dark, I could hear faint sounds downstairs. Slow, careful footsteps moving from the back door toward the living room. The floorboards groaned under the weight. Whoever it was, they were inside now. The dispatcher kept talking to me, asking where I was, but I could barely focus. Every creak of the floor felt closer. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then, suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. I strained to hear any hint of movement, but the house was dead quiet. I whispered into the phone that I thought they'd left. The dispatcher told me not to move. Then, 3 slow knocks on my bedroom door. I froze. The phone slipped out of my hand and hit the carpet. The knocks came again, louder this time. My voice was barely a whisper. "Who's there?" Silence. Then, in a low, deliberate voice just on the other side of the door, someone said, "You shouldn't be awake." My stomach dropped. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The air felt thick, like breathing through water. The sound of the doorknob turning broke the paralysis. I lunged forward and jammed a chair under the handle, bracing it. Whoever was on the other side tried again, harder this time, rattling it violently. I screamed into the phone, begging the dispatcher to send help faster. Then, as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. No footsteps retreating, no breathing, nothing. Minutes later, red and blue lights flashed across my window. I heard voices calling from downstairs, "Police." I pulled the chair away and opened the door slowly. My legs were shaking so badly I nearly collapsed halfway down the stairs. The officers searched the house, every room, every closet, even the attic. Nothing. The back door was still locked. The snow outside was untouched. No footprints, no tire marks. It was as if no one had ever been there. One of the officers stayed with me while the others walked the perimeter. He tried to assure me it was probably a dream or maybe a sound from the heating system that startled me awake. I wanted to believe him, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe it either. After they left, I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, watching the windows, listening for anything. Every tiny creak made my skin crawl. The next morning, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. On the outside of the kitchen window, there were faint smudges like fingerprints, but smaller, lower down on the glass, almost at child height. I went outside to look closer, and my heart nearly stopped. There were handprints pressed into the snow just below the window. Not full adult prints. Small. Too small. I called the police again. They came back, took pictures, and dusted the glass for prints. Nothing matched anyone in their system. They told me to stay somewhere else for the night. I packed a bag and drove to my friend Jordan's place. As I left, I caught one last glimpse of the kitchen window in my rear-view mirror. The curtain, the one that had swayed the night before, moved again. Just slightly. Jordan tried to make me laugh, told me it was probably some neighborhood kid playing a prank. But later that night, when I checked the security cameras my dad had installed months earlier, I found something that made me sick. At 2:39 a.m., the exact time I'd woken up, the camera showed the backyard. Snow falling lightly, nothing unusual. Then, slowly, from the edge of the trees, a shape appeared. A figure. Small, thin, pale against the darkness. It walked up to the kitchen window and stood there for almost 5 minutes, unmoving. Then it turned its head directly toward the camera. Even through the grainy footage, I could see the face, white, blank, no expression. Just dark, hollow eyes staring right into the lens. Then it raised one hand and tapped the glass. Twice, that same slow, deliberate rhythm. And then it was gone. When I showed the footage to the police, they couldn't identify it. Too blurry. Too dark. But they agreed that someone, or something, had been there. They told me to keep the doors locked, the lights on, and call immediately if anything else happened. I didn't go back home alone for months after that. When my parents finally returned, we installed motion lights, alarms, cameras, everything we could think of. But even with all of that, I never felt safe there again. Sometimes, even now, I dream about those 3 knocks. I'll wake up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding, and swear I can hear that same faint tapping sound somewhere in the dark. And when it's snowing outside and the world is silent again, I always check the kitchen window first. Because no matter how many locks I've changed or how bright I leave the lights, I can never shake the feeling that something out there is still waiting, patiently, just beyond the glass. Story, the end.